First up is a new film from DreamWorks Animation called The Wild Robot, and this is based on the book series of the same name by Peter Brown. I have not read the books, but I am told they are held in very high regard. The Wild Robot is about a robot named Roz, voiced by Lupita Nyong'o, and her sole purpose is to help people. Now, unfortunately for her, and this is all in trailers, she crash lands on an island that is not inhabited by humans. It is only populated with animals, and so she has to grapple with effectively reprogramming her core directives. She also becomes the mother figure to an orphaned goose named Brightbill, who is voiced by Heartstopper's Kit Connor. And rounding out their found family is a fox named Fink, voiced by Pedro Pascal. That is a lot of alliteration in a row and was very hard to say. So The Wild Robot, such a sweet film. You know, it's really nice to see a film that is original. I know it's an adaptation, but, you know, it's not a sequel. We haven't seen it before. Visually, so stunning. It's basically more of a painting than a kind of hard-surfaced 3D film, which I appreciate that takes time to develop that styling and, you know, probably costs money in terms of pipelines to just achieve the looks. The story is super sweet. I really enjoyed it. You know, also the voice cast is great. In addition to the folks I mentioned, you've got Catherine O'Hara, Bill Nighy, Stephanie Sue, Mark Hamill, Matt Berry, Ving Rhames, and it's directed and adapted by Chris Sanders, who is known for How to Train Your Dragon, Lilo and Stitch. He was the screenwriter of the animated Mulan, so generally excellent track record when it comes to animation. I think the thing I love the most about The Wild Robot is that it is certainly family friendly. You know, anyone of any age can see it, but it has a lot of deeper themes that, you know, if you want to look for them, they're there. You can also totally enjoy this as just more of a straightforward film, but I love the idea of found family. You know, I like the idea that this Roz character, robot, has to grapple with like what she has been programmed and told to do versus what like life actually throws at her and how she adapts to it. You know, I think anybody who has ever felt othered or sadly bullied will find something in the character of Brightbill because he is a runt and, you know, there are other geese who make fun of him and all that stuff. You know, it's a really heartwarming story. It's very charming. I will say in terms of like family friendliness, you know, I feel like in the beginning they over-indexed a bit on trying to keep younger audiences entertained. I feel like it's a lot of studio notes being like, no, but if there's not a joke every few minutes, like how are kids going to stay engaged? And I wish they trusted younger audiences a bit more. However, a lot of those early jokes are very funny, so I will give them credit. You know, it's just the cadence of them becomes a bit much, but it's a mild criticism. Overall, you know, I think this is one of the more refreshing films you'll probably watch this fall, honestly. I saw this at TIFF in the middle of just a slew of really heavy, dark films, so this was definitely a beacon of light, and not to say that it doesn't have its own emotional arcs. You know, I will say also the context in which I saw it might have elevated a bit more, but generally I think people are being really responsive to this. I can see why, if this is an adaptation, that people love the source material. You know, it's just, there is a lot bubbling under the surface that is really beautiful, and then there's a lot of the surface that is really beautiful. So, you know, again, aside from some of the, like, you can tell studio notes that's like, no, put a zinger here, this is a gorgeous film. There are some plot lines, and maybe they're in the books, and maybe unfortunately or fortunately or whatever you may say, they're setting up a sequel that I was like, this feels a little extraneous and diversionary to the core of the story, but here we go, sure. I'm not saying necessarily that like we should trim the runtime because it isn't a particularly long film. It's an hour and 41 minutes, but I don't see a ton of reasons not to see this film. Whether if you have kids, it's going to be a wonderful experience. If you don't have kids, that's fine. Go see it anyway. It's beautiful. I'm going to give this a 4.6 out of 5. The next film I have is a documentary out on Netflix, and it's called Will and Harper, and this is a wonderful week for me to be talking about these two films because if you need an emotional pick-me-up, like I think both of these films really serve that purpose. Will and Harper is about Will Ferrell, yes, that Will Ferrell, who one of his dear friends, who was a head writer at SNL, comes out as they are going to be transitioning, and the name they are going by now is Harper, and Will is a perfect example of an ally. You know, before, Harper used to go on these cross-country road trips and would go alone, and as a male presenting / male person, you know, not a problem for their previous life. However, as a trans woman, you know, I think Will recognized that this is going to be a different experience, and so offers to go with, and also it's an opportunity for them to bond in this new era of their friendship. This was so wonderful to watch because, you know, I have to acknowledge up front, like, Harper is a white person who, you know, I don't think they came from particular affluence to start, but they were a head writer at SNL for a few years. Like, they're not in a bad spot. So everyone in this is coming from a place of relative privilege. Race is not an issue here. There's a large intersectional community, but this is not diving into that, which I don't think it needs to. I think the thing about this film is this is a really good kind of gateway film. And I think that is why it is as powerful it is, but one cannot not acknowledge the fact that, again, people are coming from privilege. They're only having to deal with like a few aspects of in terms of, socioeconomics and race, which is fine. I'm not knocking it. The film lightly touches on these things, but it also can't be everything. So anyway, I think the relationship between them is so sweet and earnest, and I appreciate the vulnerability that they both show in this. They are both people from the comedy world, and I think it would have been very easy for this to be very flippant, but it is not. You can see the moments where Harper is grappling, and Will are grappling with these like deep emotional things, and instead from shying away from it, look, they do the same thing that most humans do, right? They will diffuse with comedy because that is their default, and that is what they are excellent at, but they are willing to show this side of themselves and a curiosity that I think a lot of people are afraid to, and I commend both of them because as public figures, especially for Will, who's a more public figure, being visible like this is such an important step in allyship. And, there are moments where Will acknowledges where he's like, oh, I could have done better in this moment, in terms of confrontations, in terms of advocating, in terms of whatever. And it's nice to see the evolution of that, like in effectively real time. And again, these two are very funny and their dynamic is very funny. So this isn't going to be a depressing, dry, educational vehicle. This is a vehicle, especially because it's a road trip, but this is fun. Like, it's fun to watch them. They clearly are actually friends. And I think there's two aspects of it, right? There's the morbid curiosities that because they are friends and because they have this trust between them that they are able to ask. And I think a lot of people publicly might have questions about, transitions and things like that. And, it's not a monolith, right? Like, Harper is just one experience in the trans experience and they don't represent everyone. But like I said, just the curiosity and making that okay and normalizing their relationship is just such a powerful thing. And I think, this is a very privileged story in many senses, but it's necessary in order to open the floodgates to tell the ones that might require a bit more of an emotional lift to grapple with. I think the film is smart about walking a line of, I won't call it fully sanitized because it does dip a little bit into kind of the public reaction to this because this, again, it's a documentary. This road trip was happening in real time. The vitriol was spewed at this, but it doesn't dwell on it too much because I think it knows that that's a second documentary. That's an entire thesis. That's a series. There's so much more to it than that. But so it does touch on it only lightly. I get why they did it. I did think maybe that part was a little bit glossed over. But again, I can understand what their motivations were and that this is a delicate thing to convey to an audience. So this is such a wonderful documentary. I think, again, the two of them are super charming together. Their chemistry is just really nice. And the other thing is, forget the trans experience part. It's also two people just in a different phase of a friendship, which is something that, as I get older, as other people get older, you have to grapple with, right? Your friends who you made 30 years ago are not the same people they are today. This has a very clear delineation, but, that it's still applicable across the board. And so I liked seeing the layers of that through this lens. It's heartwarming. The two of them are wonderful. It's not evangelizing or shoving anything down your throat. I think it's just presented with a natural curiosity and acceptance that I would love to see in more films and documentaries. I'm going to give this a 4.8 out of 5. The last film I have this week is a biopic called Lee, which is a story of American war correspondent Lee Miller, and she's being played by Kate Winslet here. And this is a tough one because based on a true story, covers World War II and the Holocaust, not a fun topic, right? And also layer onto that the gender discrimination that she faced as just somebody who wanted to be more serious. Lee Miller started out as a model, then became a photographer, and then became a war correspondent / photographer. She eventually worked for Vogue, but doing the war correspondent thing. This is tough. So subject matter, obviously tough. I do like that we are getting a different perspective here, right? Usually I feel like we glorify men in these roles or, most World War II stories are told from the perspective of male figures. So seeing a film about a female figure, Wonderful. Great. I've expressed this before. World War II is like a weird subject for me because obviously we don't want to forget, we don't want to relive it, and we want to learn from our mistakes, which is more and more frustrating these days because I'm like, come on, y'all. Like, what's going on here? How is history so easily trying to forget some of the lessons we learned here? But so, not my favorite era to cover because I also think it's well trodden and just sensitive. That aside, her performance, it's tough because like, I feel like the writing, and I don't know much about the real Lee Miller, but I feel like the writing and the performance is trying to sort of overcompensate for the competence of the character and make her, it's just like she's always right and she's a go-getter and all this stuff, which I respect. Those are admirable qualities, but there's something about the way it's presented in this, and I don't know if there's like an internalized misogyny involved in this, but I do think it's actually just like the writing and the like calibration of the performances itself, that it just like things don't quite mesh. Like I think tonally it's a bit all over the place. We also jump back and forth in time between her retelling the story to a character played by Josh O'Connor and then like the flashbacks and all the stuff. Also, I'm sorry, I know this is like such a weird thing to bump up against, but Alexander Skarsgård plays Roland Penrose, who was her partner, and he does the worst British accent ever, and I'm just like, what? There are so many British actors out there who could do a spectacular job playing this character. Like, Alexander Skarsgård is a good actor, but there was nothing about this that I was like, yes, him. He is the only person who can play this. I don't know. It's such an odd thing. It also has, like I said, it has Kate Winslet, Josh O'Connor, Alexander Skarsgård. It's got Marion Cotillard. It's got Andrea Riseborough. It's also got Andy Samberg in a very serious, straightforward role, which I give him credit for. I think the character, he's not meant as comedic relief, but he's a lighter character in his context. He plays another war photographer / correspondent. But this was not for me. It was messy in a way that I'm like, oh, I get the sense that like actually Miller probably deserved better in terms of the storytelling, the self-seriousness in certain aspects, but not in others. And then just, it felt a bit bloated. It's about 2 hours, but and I think some of it is the subject matter and it's a hard subject matter, but this was just really uneven and not for me. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5.